sisters again, and in this video I will be showing you how to stitch out blocks 1, 7, 9, and 10. And that would be, here's our 1, our block 7, our block 9, and our block 10. And basically all these blocks, the steps are all identical. I'm going to be teaching you these steps through block 10. So let's take a look at what we need to make this block. So for the blocks 1, 7, 9, and also block 10, which we're stitching out, you will need thread-wise, you will need a thread for whatever vines or leaves or stems that might be stitched in there. That's this color for me. And then the ribbon that flows through, mine is green, a lighter green, so I need my needle thread and my matching bobbin thread. And you will only need the matching bobbin thread if you are adding your backing while it's in the hoop. You will need embroidery bobbin thread, and you will also need a thread to match your fabric 1 and threads to match your fabric 2. So my background base of my blocks, I chose black and white to make it very contrasting. Then you will also need your fabric 2, which for me is this in the center, and then you'll need your fabric 1 triangle and also your strip, that is the width of the fabric for your fabric 1. You'll need your backing fabric. You will need a piece of prepared wool that's been pressed around the edges, and you will need to hoop your battleizer in the smallest hoop possible for the block that you're making. And I also want to make you aware too that just refer to your instructions for the exact size of the fabric you need based on the block size you're making. So we can go over to the machine and get started with our placement stitch and begin making our block 10. Okay, for step 1, I did not mention earlier that you need a water-soluble thread as well. So we're going to start with the water-soluble thread. We use Superior Vanish Light, and the machine is going to stitch an outline for where to place the optional wool. And it may be hard to see you stitch it, but it's just stitching a square to outline the block. Step 2, you're going to take your optional wool that's been pressed on the edges, and you're going to place it inside that placement mark. And the machine is going to sew a zigzag stitch to tack it down. And again, we're using water-soluble thread. And all you have to do is hold down the wool, keep it in place as it stitches. Okay, I have my wool zigzag down to my battleizer. Now this is a step that's optional. You don't have to add the wool if you don't want to, and if you don't want to, you just skip to this step, which is step 3. And here we're just going to sew out the pattern on top the wool or the battleizer if you're not using it. And all you have to do is just push the wool down ahead of the foot to make sure it doesn't get caught. It's also very helpful to raise your presser foot to its highest level to avoid getting it caught. Step 4, you're going to take your fabric 2 and you're going to place it right over the top of your block, and you're just going to lift it up to make sure that that triangle in the center is fully covered. And we are going to use water-soluble thread for this step, and we're just going to tack this fabric to our block. Just keep the fabric nice and smooth so you don't have any puckers. And my next step, but now what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim a scant 1/4 inch away from where the stitching is. For step 5, you'll need to change your needle thread to just a neutral thread. And you're going to take your little triangle of fabric 1 and you're going to lay it right side down with the raw edges even. And just center it, make sure you have equal amount of fabric at each end. And then you're just going to let the embroidery machine sew a seam. You will flip this fabric 1 right side up. Might be fabric 2 depending on which block you're doing, so just refer to your instructions so you have the right fabric placement. Just give it a nice finger press. And then we can move on to step 6, which is the seam here at the bottom. Now I have a brand new strip of fabric, so I'm going to make sure I cut my selvage off. Lay it right sides down with the raw edges even, giving enough room on the outside edge of your block so that we can trim it later. So about a 1/2 inch extend past the block and sew the next seam. Step 7, we will repeat doing the same fabric and sewing a seam on the other side. I am going to trim my strip of fabric about a 1/2 inch outside the block because we'll trim it down later the right, I have to check my fabric, to the right size. So here is the right side of my fabric. I'm laying that right sides down and again extending about a 1/2 inch from the edge of the block. Make the raw edges even with the raw edge of the fabric in the center and then sew the seam. And then we're going to flip the fabric and finger press. Again, you're going to then cut the end of the strip, leaving about a 1/2 inch outside the block. Step 8 is the optional step. If you're adding your backing fabric, while your block is still in the hoop and having the quilting show through to the back, then you'll do this step. If you chose to do your backing fabric once you have sections joined together, you chose that method, then you will skip over this step. So you will leave your block in the hoop and you will take your backing fabric and with the wrong side against the block, you will center it over the stitching on the block and then just lightly, gently make sure it adheres to that. And the bumpy side of the battleizer, it will cling to it a little bit better. But if it's not clinging and your fabric's falling off, just a tiny squirt of like a temporary spray adhesive like Sulky KK2000 on the underside will get it to stick perfectly and it won't gum up your needle. So step 8, here we go. We're going to sew our backing on there. You can see it's kind of hanging on. Thank goodness. I have changed to water-soluble thread. And I'm just going to peek underneath here. Yep, my backing is still in place, but we use the water-soluble thread so that as you're stitching to tack all this down, and then you sew your blocks together, that edge stitching could possibly show once you get all your blocks sewn together. So with water-soluble thread, we can just dab it a little, and that way it'll come right out. All right, so just hold your pieces in place, keep them nice and smooth. All right, so now we have our backing on there. I did want to show you something that happened with this block is when it came up here, it had the fabric was added afterwards. It had kind of like an uphill my foot caught it. So there's probably about 3 stitches that it took flipping that fabric the wrong direction. So all you have to do if that happens, and you forget to hold that piece of fabric down with your finger like I did, is just cut out those 3 stitches. It's gonna be okay. You'll still be able to trim them out without that. So let me take care of the little problem I created. It's always a way to fix problems. One more little stitch. All right. And then you can just finger press it and move on. Okay, for step 9, it's the first of the quilting that's going on in our block. And your thread will always match whatever color you have in the middle for your first quilting step on all these blocks. So for me, it is my thread B, which matches my fabric 2. Now I added the backing to the back, as you just saw. So in order to keep that backing looking really nice, we recommend turning off your automatic thread cutter and also bringing your matching bobbin thread to the top of your block before you begin stitching. And that helps prevent little bird nest looking things on the back, and it makes the back look much prettier. So it's just gonna sew some quilting, and we'll come back for step 10. For step 10, I put thread A in the needle, and I'm going to do some more quilting. So again, I'm bringing my needle thread or bobbin thread to the top, and we'll sew some quilting. Stop and clip the thread tails and let it continue. Two steps you'll see in this design would be the ribbon stitching that you see through there. So that would be doing this step with both of those in the needle and in the bobbin if you have your backing added. And the final step is some of the blocks will have more vines and leaves to be stitched on it. So then you choose that thread that you've chosen and do that. Now I've chosen on my block to do something different with a different sort of sample, just to kind of give you an idea of what you can do with this. This is an extremely versatile block that can be repeated with alternating fabric placement, and it comes out and makes its own stunningly a beautiful quilt. So I'd like to show you what I'm doing for the second little mini quilt that I'm making with my 5-inch blocks. And as you can see, I'm doing it with the black and white and red fabric. This is actually 10A that you just saw stitch out. So you can see I don't have the entire picture of the quilt with that ribbon flowing through it. So I'm going to skip it for this small sample that is just going to be the center of the quilt. So here's my identical block, which will go down, way down here when I get them all finished in that corner. So now I'll show you how to trim that. Okay, I just thought of a tip that I always do that would be helpful to everyone, and that is while I'm stitching the block, I always write the block number on the battleizer in the corner. That way I know and I won't get confused, because some of these blocks just have different color placement and different placement in your quilt. So it's helpful to remember what that is. And then after I trim it up, I will find a place maybe with a water-soluble pen or a friction pen or just a light pencil to write somewhere in the seam allowance what that block number is. And I usually write that at the top, that way I know its orientation as well. So now we're going to talk about trimming this block. Since I have only making a mini quilt with just that center part, I need to know where my binding edges are going to go, where the corner of this block is going to be. So I have figured that out based on orientation and fabric placement and everything, and I marked little X's here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my trimmer by George, and I'm going to find the 1/4 inch mark, and I'm going to lay it on that thread. It's a little more challenging with black fabric, so If it's a little easier on the other side, go ahead and flip your block over, and you're going to mark the 1/4 inch mark right on that basting stitch. And then we're going to trim this away. And that is going to, of course, reduce the bulk in the seam allowance. We're getting stubborn here. Okay, and then I'm going to flip this back over. And this was my other spot here on this side that needs to be trimmed through all layers because it will have binding. It's the edge of my quilt. So I'll do it from the back side since it's easier. Black's always a challenge if you have black marks on your ruler. So just don't forget you can flip it over. These other two sides, I'm going to use the Trimmer by George metal edge because these two sides will be joined to another block. So you just, again, slide the metal edge between the fabric on the front and the battleizer, lay it down, make sure there's no fabric peeking out, and then you use your rotary cutter to cut the excess off to reduce that bulk. So I'm going to do the same thing on this side. Then it's just like sewing a quilt top together with no bulk. All right, so now that I had that trimmed up, we also need to trim the fabric on the front to 1/4 inch, and that will be the seam allowance for our quilt. So again, I'm going to do it from this side since it's a little easier on the black fabric. And one more side to trim. So there's our completed block 10A and a completed block 10B. So thank you for watching the video. I hope it has helped you, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.